In 1958, 2 years before Nigerian independence, a British colonial official named Sir Ralph wrote a confidential memorandum that has never entered mainstream Nigerian political discourse. In it, he described the question of what to do with Islamic criminal law in the North as the single most dangerous unresolved problem in the constitutional architecture of the country Britain was preparing to hand over not the revenue-sharing formula, not the regional seat allocation, not the military command structure, the Sharia question. He described it as a device that could be used to fracture the federation from the inside by northern political actors who understood that Islamic criminal law was the one institutional demand that the South could never accept, the federal government could never formally authorize, and the British could never openly suppress without triggering a political crisis that would destroy the independence transition they had spent years managing. He was right on all three counts. And the solution Britain arrived at in the 1960 Penal Code compromise that replaced the existing mixture of Islamic criminal provisions and British common law with a single codified Northern Penal Code was not a resolution of the Sharia question. It was a postponement of it. A legal construction designed to give northern populations enough Islamic content to satisfy the political pressure from below while giving the British and the federal constitutional framework enough secular structure to maintain the fiction of a unified national legal system. That postponement lasted 39 years. Until October 27, 1999, when Ahmad Sani Yerima detonated it in Zamfara. Everything that this channel has investigated across this entire series, the 12 states, the Hizbah, the death sentences for WhatsApp messages, the women sentenced to death for becoming pregnant, the Boko Haram genealogy, the Saudi funding pipeline, the Supreme Court's 25 years of silence, all of it runs back through a traceable chain of institutional decisions to the specific legal compromise British colonial administrators made in 1960 because they were afraid of what would happen if they did not make it, and afraid of what they were creating by making it. This investigation is about that fear. What the British knew, what they built to manage what they knew, why what they built was always going to fail, and why the Nigerian political class, across 65 years of independence, has continued to manage the same fear with the same postponement, rather than the resolution that the evidence has always demanded. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand the 1960 Penal Code compromise, you have to understand the legal situation the British inherited in the North and what they spent 50 years trying to manage before they finally ran out of time at independence. When Lugard defeated the Sokoto Caliphate's military resistance in Kano and Sokoto in 1903 and established British colonial authority over the Northern Protectorate, he was not conquering a legal vacuum. He was conquering a functional legal system. The Caliphate had administered Islamic law, Maliki school jurisprudence, as its primary legal framework for almost a century. The Emirate courts were the courts of record. The Alkali judges were the established judiciary. The legal procedures, the evidentiary standards, the punishment framework, and the jurisprudential tradition were all in place and operating. Lugard's indirect rule doctrine, the administrative logic documented in this channel's previous investigation into Britain's construction of northern power, required him to work through existing institutions rather than replace them. He did not have enough magistrates, he did not have enough money to build a parallel court system, and he did not have the political capital to impose a wholesale dismantling of an Islamic legal tradition that was central to the religious and civic identity of the millions of Muslims he was now governing. So he made a compromise. The Islamic courts would continue. The Alkali judges would continue. Islamic personal law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, property between Muslims would remain under Islamic court jurisdiction, but Islamic criminal law, the hudud punishments, the capital sentences, the physical punishment would be subject to a native court proclamation that theoretically required British oversight of the most severe sentences. In practice, this oversight was uneventful, under-resourced, and frequently ignored. The colonial administration documented in its own internal reports cases of hudud punishments being administered without British review, floggings that were never reported upward, amputations that occurred outside the oversight structure. The gap between the theoretical framework and the operational reality was visible from the first years of the protectorate. And the British knew it. Their internal correspondence, available in the colonial records at Kew, shows a consistent awareness that the Islamic criminal law question was being managed rather than resolved, that the oversight framework was a political cover rather than a genuine legal constraint, that the alkali courts were operating with a degree of criminal jurisdiction that the British framework theoretically did not authorize, but practically could not prevent. This managed ambiguity, Islamic criminal law continuing to operate in practice under a theoretical framework of British oversight, was the foundational legal reality of northern Nigeria from 1903 to 1958. For 58 years, Britain governed the North by not resolving the question of what Islamic criminal law's status actually was. Then independence became imminent, and the question could no longer be postponed indefinitely. Now, examine the specific political crisis that made the 1960 Penal Code compromise necessary, because the crisis had a precise trigger, specific actors, and a documented urgency that shaped every decision that followed. By the late 1950s, the constitutional negotiations for Nigerian independence were producing the framework that this channel documented in the Britain and the Moth investigation. The regional structure, the seat allocation, the federal character arrangement that gave the North its constitutional majority. But the legal question was running on a separate and equally urgent track. The Northern People's Congress, Ahmadu Bello's party, the political vehicle of the Northern establishment, was under pressure from its own constituents and from Islamic scholars within the North who wanted a clear commitment that independence would mean the removal of Islamic law from the governance of Muslim populations. The NPC's political legitimacy with its base was partly constructed on the argument that Northern Muslims could trust the NPC to protect Islamic institutional life from the secular, Southern-dominated federal structures that independence would create. The British simultaneously were under pressure from the southern political parties, the NCNC and the Action Group, who were alarmed by the possibility that independence would produce a northern regional government operating a criminal justice system based on Islamic law. The South's political leadership understood that Islamic criminal law in the North was incompatible with the kind of unified national legal framework that a functioning federal state required, and they demanded that independence produce a single national criminal law applicable across all regions.
Between these two pressures, Northern demand for Islamic legal continuity and Southern demand for national legal unity, Britain was caught exactly in the position the 1958 memorandum had identified as the single most dangerous unresolved problem in the constitutional architecture. The solution they arrived at was the work of a man named Sir Maurice, a British legal expert commissioned to draft a criminal code for the northern region that would resolve the crisis without triggering either of the political explosions it contained. His brief was precise and almost impossibly constrained. He had to produce a criminal code that was sufficiently Islamic in content and structure to satisfy the NPC's political base and the Islamic scholars who were watching the independence process with intense scrutiny. It had to be sufficiently secular and modern in form to satisfy the southern political parties and the federal constitutional framework. It had to be codified, written down in a single document, rather than based on open-ended reference to Islamic jurisprudential sources, because codification gave the appearance of a bounded, defined legal system, rather than an open-ended religious one. And it had to be compatible with the Independence Constitution's human rights provisions, which guaranteed freedom of religion and prohibited discrimination on religious grounds. What Morris produced, the 1959 Penal Code that came into force in the northern region in 1960, was a document that attempted to satisfy all of those contradictory requirements simultaneously. It drew heavily on the Sudan Penal Code, itself a colonial legal hybrid that had been developed to manage the same Islamic law question in a different British-administered territory. It retained Islamic law's influence in its structure, its terminology, and many of its substantive provisions. It removed the most internationally controversial hudud punishments, the death sentence for adultery, the amputation for theft, the stonings, replacing them with imprisonments and fines that were defensible under the Independence Constitution's human rights framework. It was, in the most precise analytical sense, a legal fiction. It created the appearance of a unified, rights-compatible criminal code while preserving the substantive Islamic legal architecture underneath a codified secular surface. The Alkali judges continued, the Islamic courts continued, the Islamic jurisprudential tradition continued informing criminal adjudication in ways that the code's secular surface did not fully acknowledge or constrain. And the political pressure that demanded Islamic criminal law in the north did not disappear. It was managed, temporarily, by a document that gave northern political actors enough Islamic content to defend to their constituents, while giving the federal framework enough secular structure to maintain the fiction of national legal unity. Now, examine what the British were actually afraid of, because the fear was more specific than a general concern about religious conflict, and understanding its specific content explains everything about the compromise they built. The British fear had three distinct and documented components. The first was the fear of northern political fracture. The NPC's political unity, the consolidation of the North's diverse populations behind a single political vehicle that Britain's constitutional design had made the determinant of federal power, depended on maintaining Islamic institutional legitimacy as the NPC's primary claim to Northern Muslim loyalty. If independence produced a federal government that visibly stripped Islamic criminal law from the North's legal framework, the NPC would face a challenge from more conservative Islamic political forces that would split the Northern vote. A split Northern vote meant a fragmented constitutional majority. A fragmented constitutional majority meant an unstable federal government at the moment of independence, the worst possible outcome for a colonial administration trying to manage an orderly transfer of power. The second fear was the fear of southern political crisis. If independence produced a northern regional government openly administering Islamic criminal law, the southern political parties would face irresistible pressure from their own constituents to demand either a constitutional amendment prohibiting it or a reconsideration of the entire federal framework. Either of these outcomes would delay or derail the independence timeline that Britain had committed to publicly and was managing diplomatically. The independence date was fixed. The constitutional framework was largely settled. A last-minute crisis over Islamic criminal law would unravel years of negotiation.
The third fear, the most fundamental one, documented most clearly in the confidential internal correspondence rather than in the public constitutional debates, was the fear that the Islamic criminal law question was not actually resolvable within the constitutional framework they were building. That the tension between a genuinely Islamic criminal jurisdiction in the North and a unified national legal framework in the Federation was not a tension that clever legal drafting could permanently contain. That they were creating a constitutional time bomb by building independence on the unresolved foundation of this question rather than addressing it directly. The 1958 memorandum that opened this investigation named this fear explicitly. The Sharia question, it argued, was a device that could be used to fracture the Federation from the inside because it was the one institutional demand that could not be permanently satisfied within the constitutional framework they were building and could not be permanently denied without triggering the political crisis the framework was designed to prevent. The British response to this fear was not to resolve it. It was to build the 1960 Penal Code, a legal document specifically designed to manage the fear for long enough that it became someone else's problem. The someone else was the independent Nigerian state. The problem is the one this channel has been investigating for this entire series. Now, examine how the compromise was received in the North, in the South, and within the Islamic scholarly community, because the reception reveals exactly how unstable the compromise was from the moment it was made. In the North, the NPC's political leadership accepted the 1960 Penal Code as a political necessity, rather than embracing it as a genuinely Islamic expression of governance. Ahmadu Bello was sophisticated enough to understand what the code was, a managed compromise, not an Islamic criminal code. He accepted it because the alternative, an open confrontation with the federal constitutional framework over full Islamic criminal law before independence, risked the constitutional majority arrangement that gave the North its federal dominance. The political trade was accept the managed compromise now, preserve the constitutional structure, and address the Islamic law question from a position of federal power. Within the Islamic scholarly community, the reception was more contested and more instructive. A significant body of northern Nigerian Islamic scholarship, the Alkali tradition, the Maliki jurisprudence scholars, the Islamic court judges whose entire professional formation was in the Sharia framework, viewed the 1960 Penal Code as precisely what it was, a secular legal document with Islamic surface features that left the substantive claims of Islamic governance unmet. They accepted it under political pressure from the NPC. They did not endorse it as adequate, and they continued through the entire period from 1960 to 1999 to maintain the scholarly and institutional argument that authentic Islamic governance required the full restoration of Islamic criminal law that the 1960 Compromise had suspended.
This continuing scholarly argument, maintained inside the institutional Islamic infrastructure of the North across 4 decades of independence, is the intellectual foundation of the 1999 Sharia expansion. When Ahmad Sani Yerima announced in October 1999 that Zamfara would adopt full Sharia criminal law, he was not making a new argument. He was finally acting on an argument that had been maintained inside northern Nigerian Islamic scholarship since 1960. The 1960 Compromise had not resolved the demand for Islamic criminal law. It had preserved it institutionally, in the Alkali courts, in the Islamic scholarly networks, in the Maliki jurisprudential tradition, waiting for a political moment when the cost of continued postponement exceeded the cost of implementation. In the South, the 1960 Penal Code was received with a relief that subsequent events have shown was entirely misplaced. The southern political parties accepted the code's sufficient fact for value, believing that the codification of criminal law in the North had resolved the Islamic criminal jurisdiction question permanently. They did not have the internal British correspondence that documented the compromise's fundamental instability. They did not have the institutional knowledge of northern Islamic scholarly thought that would have told them the argument for full Islamic criminal law had not been abandoned,
only deferred. Now, trace the 39 years between the 1960 compromise and the 1999 detonation, because those years were not a period of resolution, they were a period of accumulation. Every factor that made 1999 possible was building across those decades, and the building was visible to anyone who was paying attention. The first accumulation was the Saudi theological infrastructure. As documented in previous investigations on this channel, Saudi Arabia began serious mosque building and madrasa funding operations in northern Nigeria from the late 1970s. The Muslim World League, the Izala Movement 1978 founding with documented Saudi financial support, the scholarship pipeline to Medina University, the progressive displacement of the Sufi Islamic tradition by Wahhabi theological content. This process had a specific legal implication that has never been adequately examined. The Sufi Islamic tradition that had historically dominated northern Nigeria, the Tijaniya and Qadiriya orders, had an institutional relationship with the 1960 Penal Code compromise that was in its own way accommodating. Sufi Islam practice in northern Nigeria was more focused on spiritual development, on the master-disciple relationship, on the internal cultivation of faith, and less on the political implementation of a specific criminal code as a matter of divine obligation. Wahhabism changed this. The Wahhabi theological framework that Saudi funding introduced into northern Nigeria is, in its political implications, far more insistent on the implementation of Islamic criminal law as a governance requirement. In the Wahhabi framework, a Muslim-majority territory that does not implement Islamic criminal law is not in a transitional state. It is in a state of failure, of compromise with un-Islamic governance, of submission to foreign legal frameworks that have no legitimate authority over Muslim populations. The progressive displacement of Sufi institutional dominance by Wahhabi theological content across the 1980s and 1990s was in legal terms a progressive erosion of the cultural and theological conditions that had made the 1960 compromise stable. The compromise had been made with a northern Islamic tradition that could accommodate managed ambiguity. Saudi funding built a northern Islamic tradition that could not. The second accumulation was the governance failure of the post-independence northern state. The 1960 Penal Code compromise was politically sustainable as long as the northern regional and later state governments were delivering enough governance, enough justice, enough institutional performance that the population's primary political demand was for better governance rather than for Islamic governance. When the governance failed, when the roads were not built, the schools deteriorated, the courts became inaccessible, the poverty deepened, the Islamic governance argument moved from the margins to the center of northern political discourse. Not because the population had become more theologically conservative, though the Saudi-funded theological shift was also happening simultaneously, but because the secular governance framework had demonstrably failed to deliver what it had promised. By the late 1990s, 16 years of military rule had accelerated both the governance failure and the theological shift. The population that Ahmed Sani Yerima addressed in October 1999 had lived through Babangida's structural adjustment devastation, Abacha's looting, the complete collapse of public services, and a democratic transition that had produced elected governors with no governance capacity and enormous electoral pressure to deliver something, anything that looked like change. The 1960 Penal Code compromise had been built on the assumption that the northern state would deliver enough secular governance to make the Islamic criminal law demand manageable. The northern state had not delivered. The assumption had failed, and the device that the 1958 British Memorandum had identified as capable of fracturing the federation from the inside was activated by a first-term governor who understood exactly what he was activating and why. Now examine what the 1999 expansion revealed about the 1960 Compromise's actual legal architecture. Because the way 12 governors expanded Sharia in 1999 and 2000 tells us precisely where the compromise had always been weakest. The 1960 Penal Code had removed the hudud criminal punishments from the codified law of the northern region, but it had not abolished the Islamic court system. The Alkali courts continued, the Sharia courts of appeal continued, the Islamic jurisprudential tradition continued informing the court's operations in ways that the secular code's surface did not fully constrain. When the 12 governors adopted full Sharia criminal law in 1999 and 2000, the institutional infrastructure they needed to implement it already existed. The courts were there, the judges, trained in Islamic jurisprudence, were there. The community acceptance of Islamic judicial authority was there. The governors did not build a new legal system from scratch. They removed the secular surface that the 1960 Compromise had placed over an Islamic legal infrastructure that had never been fully replaced.
This is the most important architectural fact in the entire story of Nigerian Sharia, and it is the one most consistently missed in mainstream analysis. The 1960 Penal Code did not dismantle the Islamic legal system of the North. It covered it. It placed a secular legal document over an Islamic institutional infrastructure that remained operational, remained respected, and remained the primary legal reference point for the Islamic scholarly community across 39 years of independence. When the political conditions changed in 1999, removing the cover was far simpler than building a new structure would have been. The structure was already there. It had been there before 1903. The British had never dismantled it. The 1960 Compromise had never dismantled it. It had simply been covered with a document that its own architects knew was a postponement rather than a resolution. This is also why the Supreme Court's 25-year silence on the constitutional validity of criminal Sharia is, in its own institutional logic, explicable, if not defensible. Ruling that the 1999 Sharia expansion is unconstitutional would require the court to also examine whether the 1960 Compromise itself was constitutionally adequate. And that examination would expose the full history of managed ambiguity that British colonial administration built into the Nigerian legal framework. It would expose not just the governors who expanded Sharia in 1999, but the entire constitutional architecture that made the expansion possible. That is an institutional confrontation that the Supreme Court has never been willing to initiate, not because the justices do not understand what the evidence shows, but because what the evidence shows is too structurally damaging to the entire post-independence constitutional framework to be addressed without consequences that reach far beyond any single ruling. Now, address the counter-arguments, because this analysis will attract serious objections from multiple directions and each deserves a serious response. The strongest counter-argument comes from within Islamic jurisprudence itself. The argument is that the 1960 Penal Code Compromise was an illegitimate imposition, that Britain had no right to suspend Islamic criminal law in the North, and that the 1999 Sharia expansion was not a political exploitation of a legal vacuum, but a legitimate restoration of rights that colonial authority had wrongly removed. On this reading, the British fear of Sharia was not a reasonable administrative concern about constitutional coherence, but a colonial imposition of secular legal frameworks on Muslim populations who did not choose them and who retained the right to restore their own legal tradition when political conditions permitted.
This argument must be taken seriously because it is made by serious people and it addresses a genuine historical injustice, the colonial imposition of legal frameworks on populations who did not choose them. The response is precise and does not require dismissing the historical injustice. The question of whether Islamic criminal law is legitimate for Muslim populations who choose it is a theological and political question that this investigation does not adjudicate. The question this investigation addresses is different: whether the specific institutional model built in the 12 Nigerian states since 1999 represents the authentic restoration of Islamic justice that its architects claimed it would be, or whether it represents the political use of Islamic legal authority to serve the interest of a governing class while delivering nothing measurable to the populations in whose name it was implemented. The victims documented in this series, Safia Husseini, Amina Lawa, Yahaya Sharif Aminu, Omar Farouk, the 10 million out-of-school children, the women with the highest maternal mortality rates in the Federation, answer that question with the consistency that 25 years of documented evidence produces.
Here's what nobody is saying. The answer to the question this investigation opened with: why did the British fear Sharia? Because they understood, in their internal correspondence, in their confidential assessments, in the 1958 memorandum that named it as the single most dangerous unresolved problem in the constitutional architecture, that the tension between genuine Islamic criminal governance and a unified national legal framework was not resolvable through legal drafting. That the 1960 Penal Code compromise they built was a postponement, not a resolution. That they were handing independent Nigeria a constitutional time bomb, and that the only question was how long it would take to detonate. The answer was 39 years. And the truth behind the 1960 compromise is this: it was not built to resolve the Sharia question. It was built to ensure that the Sharia question became Nigeria's problem rather than Britain's. The managed ambiguity was deliberate. The legal fiction was intentional. The constitutional time bomb was visible to the people who built it. They built it anyway, because resolving it would have cost them the orderly independence transition they needed. The independent Nigerian state inherited that bomb. Every administration since 1960 made the same choice the British made in 1960, to manage the ambiguity rather than resolve it, to postpone the confrontation rather than bear its cost, to pass the problem forward rather than absorb the political expense of addressing it. Until October 27, 1999, when Ahmad Sani Yerima activated it in Zamfara, in front of a crowd that had been waiting 39 years for someone to finally say what the 1960 compromise had been built to prevent anyone from saying. The bomb did not detonate because of Yerima. It detonated because everyone before him had chosen the postponement. And the choice of postponement, made in London in 1960, repeated in Lagos and Abuja across 39 years, is the most important political choice in the history of the constitutional crisis that this channel has spent this entire series investigating. Here's my question for the comments. The British knew in 1958 that the 1960 compromise was a time bomb. They built it anyway. 6 Nigerian administrations between 1960 and 1999 knew the same thing and made the same choice. Who carries the greater responsibility for what detonated in 1999? The British colonial administration that built the bomb, or the Nigerian political class that had 39 years and full sovereign authority to defuse it and chose not to? One answer. Drop it below. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.